Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe and stay until the end of this journey. What you'll hear may challenge everything you believe about power, technology, and the human soul, but it might also awaken something you've always felt deep within. It all started quietly, almost insignificantly, the kind of event that only later reveals its true weight. I was in Zurich, in my study, surrounded by the old scent of leather-bound books and the soft whisper of paper, when I received a message that would unsettle the calm rhythm of my days. It came from an old colleague in the United States, a man of science, level-headed, not prone to hysteria, but his words carried a strange urgency. "Carl, pay attention to what's emerging here. Something is taking shape beneath the surface, something that mirrors the symbols of revelation." I felt that old stirring within me, the intuition that the unconscious was moving, constellating a pattern. He mentioned reports, documents from the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and then added a line that still echoes in my mind. Read Revelation, chapter 13, and then look at what our institutions have just announced. At first I smiled at the thought. Yet, when I opened my worn Bible, not as a theologian but as a psychologist, and read those words once again, I felt a deep recognition. The prophecy spoke of a system of absolute control, of a mark without which no one could buy or sell. For years, I had studied this text as a metaphor, an image of the collective shadow and the human thirst for domination. But what if those symbols were no longer confined to dreams and visions? What if they were finding form, in algorithms, in digital currencies, in biometric systems? I've spent my life exploring what lies beneath the surface of human consciousness. I've learned that archetypes never die, they only change shape. The gods of old return wearing modern masks, political, technological, institutional. And what I saw emerging from America in 2025 was not new. It was ancient. The same power that men once worshipped as gods of order and control was now reborn through machines, code, and data. That night, I could not sleep. I walked through my library, touching the spines of books written by alchemists, mystics, and psychologists, men who also tried to give meaning to the unseen. I realized then that what I had dismissed as symbolic was beginning to breathe, to move, to speak through the structures of our time. This was no longer theory, it was manifestation. And it was only the beginning. When I began to connect the pieces, a disturbing realization emerged, one that I could no longer ignore. The same nation that once stood as the symbol of freedom and individual will was now unconsciously building the architecture of control. I had always admired the American spirit, its resistance to tyranny, its fierce belief in independence. Yet beneath that radiant ideal, I started to sense a darkness, a shadow forming, vast and silent. In Jungian psychology, we call this process enantiodromia, the turning of something into its opposite. What begins as light eventually seeks its reflection in darkness. It is an ancient law of the psyche. And America, founded upon liberty, seemed to be approaching that point of inversion. The ideals of freedom, once sacred, were gradually transforming into their mirror image: security through surveillance, protection through control, unity through obedience. The documents my colleague sent became my map. They described the birth of a new system, a digital dollar linked to biometric identification, a mechanism meant to modernize financial transactions. But in those words of progress, I saw something archetypal, the re-emergence of the beast, not as a monster from scripture, but as a psychological pattern, the shadow of power itself. It was not driven by malice, but by fear, the collective fear of chaos. The American mind, like the individual psyche, seeks order when threatened, and order when exaggerated becomes oppression. It struck me then, humanity's deepest paradox is that our longing for safety often summons the very thing we fear most. I remembered a passage I wrote decades ago, that the greater the repression of the shadow, the more violently it returns. What I saw in 2025 was not a political event, but a psychic one, a civilization entering its dark night of the soul, where all that was hidden must surface. I began observing the public discourse, the speeches of leaders, the debates on news networks. What fascinated me most was not the content, but the tone. Calm, reasonable, persuasive. Every measure was presented as rational, as progress, as care for the citizen. Security, they said. Stability, they promised. But I heard another voice beneath those words, the whisper of the unconscious murmuring, "Submit. Trust the system. Let us think for you." It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a psychological inevitability. When fear rules, consciousness narrows, and the collective mind surrenders its freedom in exchange for certainty. What America was building was not merely an economic system. It was a mirror, reflecting humanity's own unhealed wounds. And as I stood before that mirror, I realized something deeper. The empire was not falling from external enemies. It was being consumed from within, not by corruption or politics, but by the archetype of power, rising again through the unconscious will of an entire civilization. The descent had begun, but beneath the darkness a deeper pattern was unfolding, one that I needed to understand before it was too late. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. What was unfolding was no longer confined to government halls or secret rooms. It was everywhere, silent, elegant, almost invisible. I called it the web, not just a network of machines or algorithms, but a living symbol, an image of the collective psyche made manifest through technology. In the autumn of 2025, I traveled to San Francisco. The city was shrouded in mist, as if nature itself were trying to veil what was happening there. I met with an old friend, a psychologist who worked as an advisor to major technology companies. We walked through the quiet paths of Golden Gate Park, our conversation suspended between science and something sacred. He spoke softly, almost with reverence, about the new projects being developed in Silicon Valley, systems of identity verification, biometric profiles, neural pattern recognition. Every company, he said, is moving toward total integration, not by command, but by instinct. It's as if they're possessed by an idea. That word struck me, possessed. In psychology, possession does not mean demonic control, but rather domination by an archetype, a force of the unconscious that captures the collective imagination. I realized these corporations, these brilliant minds, were not consciously conspiring. They were being drawn magnetically toward a shared vision, the illusion of omniscience, of total knowledge and control. They called it efficiency, personalization, safety. But underneath I sensed something ancient, the return of the father archetype in its dark aspect, the tyrant disguised as protector, the guardian who watches everything. In mythology, such figures always begin as saviors and end as jailers. Later that night, from my hotel window, I looked out over the city lights, thousands of points of data pulsing like neurons. I imagined each light connected to another, forming an immense network stretching beyond the horizon. A web not spun by spiders, but by human fear and ambition. In dreams, this image often appears, a vast net covering the earth, delicate yet unbreakable. For years my patients had described it. They didn't know why, but they felt trapped, watched, suspended in something unseen. And now, standing above the digital heart of the world, I realized the dream had become matter. The mark on the forehead and hand, once symbolic, was transforming into code and biometric scans. Thought and action, the mind and the body, were being synchronized under the same watchful system. It was the psychological meaning of revelation expressed through circuitry. I wrote in my journal that night, "The beast no longer roars. It hums quietly in the background of human life." Yet even then, I sensed this was not only an American phenomenon. The patterns were spreading, synchronized, simultaneous. The same dream was visiting other nations, other minds. Something global was awakening, an archetype stretching its limbs through data, through wires, through us. And that realization led me to the next stage of my investigation, understanding how far this pattern extended beyond the empire, into the entire world. What I once thought was a localized phenomenon soon revealed its true scale. The pattern that began in America had already crossed oceans. It was not a political movement or an economic alliance. It was a psychic contagion, spreading through the collective unconscious of humanity. Every civilization, in its own language and with its own technology, was building a different face of the same structure. China called it the digital yuan, Europe its EUDI wallet, India its Aadhaar identity system. Each claimed unique goals: modernization, inclusion, safety. Yet beneath their slogans I saw identical patterns: centralization, surveillance, dependency. It was as if the same invisible hand guided all of them, shaping a unified design. In 2020, during the world's Great Pause, the World Economic Forum announced its Great Reset, a phrase that echoed with eerie symbolism. The words spoke of rebirth, reconstruction, renewal. But from a psychological standpoint, they carried another meaning: the attempt to rebuild the ego of civilization after crisis. Whenever the ego collapses, the shadow rushes in to fill the void, and this shadow took form in the dream of a perfect, controlled world, one where individuality would be sacrificed for efficiency, spontaneity for order. I gained access to internal documents describing a new financial framework called the Unified Ledger, designed by the Bank for International Settlements, the Bank of Central Banks. Reading its 230 pages, I felt the same unease I once experienced when analyzing the dreams of patients before a psychotic break. Every line reflected an obsessive desire for unity, for total interconnection. It was the unus mundus, the one world, but not in its divine form. This was the mechanical, soulless version, a unity of control rather than consciousness. And again, the language was seductive: sustainability, security, global cooperation. Yet in psychology, the brightest words often hide the deepest drives. Humanity was promising peace and unknowingly summoning domination. When they say peace and safety, I recalled from Thessalonians, then sudden destruction shall come. This, I realized, was not the beginning of a dystopia engineered by tyrants, but a mass enactment of an archetype, the eternal longing for order at any cost. The collective psyche had grown weary of freedom's chaos. It wanted rest, predictability, protection. It wanted the cage. I was reminded of Pompeii, that beautiful city that perished beneath its own ignorance of the trembling mountain above. People there lived, traded, loved, unaware that the earth beneath them was alive and restless. Humanity now stood in a similar place. The volcano was no longer made of fire and stone, but of code and data, silently preparing its eruption. The signs were visible to anyone willing to see, but most looked away, numbed by comfort, distracted by screens. The web was no longer invisible, it was planetary. And I understood then. What we faced was not the birth of a system, but the awakening of an archetype, one that had slept for 2 millennia and was now opening its eyes through human invention. The more I studied this phenomenon, the clearer it became that its true nature was not political nor technological, it was spiritual. Humanity was not merely building new systems, it was sculpting a new relationship with power itself. And at the heart of this transformation lay a single haunting symbol that had endured for 2,000 years, the mark of the beast. For centuries, theologians debated what that mark might be: a physical brand, a number, an external sign. But from the perspective of depth psychology, its meaning runs deeper. The mark is not imposed upon the flesh first, it is inscribed upon the psyche. It is a psychological condition, a surrender of the individual self to the collective machine. I once spoke with a rabbi in Jerusalem who studied the Kabbalah. We discussed this very passage from Revelation, the mark upon the forehead and upon the hand. He told me something that has never left me. The forehead symbolizes thought, the hand symbolizes action. The mark means control over both, over what man thinks and what he does. And that, I realized, is precisely what these emerging systems achieve. Through algorithms that predict your desires, through digital currencies that define your limits, through biometric IDs that verify your existence, your thoughts and actions become measurable, adjustable, governable. The mark is not forced upon you, it is accepted willingly in the name of convenience, comfort, and belonging. I recalled a principle I have observed countless times in my patients. When fear and uncertainty rise, people long for authority. They seek something or someone to tell them what to do, what to believe, who to trust. They surrender freedom for safety and call it progress. This is what I called the savior complex of civilization, the yearning for a benevolent master, which inevitably awakens a tyrant. Many believe they will recognize oppression when it arrives, but the most effective chains are woven from reassurance. You are not told to obey, you are invited to comply. You are not commanded to submit, you are persuaded to trust. The psychological illusion is complete when control feels like care, and so the mark appears not as a stamp, but as a state of mind. It is the quiet death of the self, the abandonment of inner authority for external validation. It is the refusal of individuation, the sacred process by which each soul becomes whole. In the end, this is not about systems or governments, but about what dwells within us. For every empire that enslaves, there is a part of the human psyche that desires to be enslaved, a shadow longing to be absorbed into the collective, to escape the burden of choice. And yet, even in that darkness, I sensed a faint light, a whisper that perhaps this confrontation was necessary, that humanity must lose itself before it can remember what it truly is. When I reached the end of my inquiry, I understood something that years of study had not yet revealed. The story of the beast is not a tale of despair, it is a map of transformation. The darkness that now rises is not the end of humanity. It is the beginning of a deeper consciousness struggling to be born. Prophecy, I realized, is never meant to terrify. It exists to awaken. The Book of Revelation, when read through the eyes of the soul, describes not the punishment of the world, but the process of individuation on a planetary scale. Humanity must descend into its shadow before it can ascend into wholeness. The systems being built, the digital currencies, the surveillance grids, the centralized structures, are mirrors reflecting what lies unhealed within us. They are the externalization of our inner condition. Every database, every algorithm, every policy of control is a symbol of the ego's inflation, the human attempt to play God without embodying divine wisdom. We built machines to watch the world because we no longer watch ourselves. Yet the same psychology that reveals the danger also reveals the cure. For what is born in shadow can only be redeemed through awareness. To see the pattern is to break its spell. The only power the beast truly holds is over those who remain unconscious of it. And so the task before us is not rebellion, but remembrance, remembering who we are beyond systems, beyond fear, beyond the collective hypnosis. It is to keep the flame of the self alive even when surrounded by darkness. You may live within the machine, but the machine does not have to live within you. The early Christians who gathered in Rome's catacombs understood this truth. Surrounded by the empire's brutality, they painted symbols of hope on the walls: fish, anchors, doves. They did not deny the darkness. They transformed it by remaining conscious, loving human. Their faith was not naive optimism. It was awareness of an inner light that no empire could extinguish. Today, we face our own Rome, a new empire built not of stone, but of data. And yet the same principle applies. If consciousness endures, the soul cannot be conquered. The collective night we are entering may be long, but no night is eternal. For even in the vision of Revelation, the story does not end with the beast. It ends with renewal, a new heaven and a new earth, where sorrow and fear no longer rule. Psychologically, that is the integration of the shadow, the rebirth of the self. So let us not fear what is coming, but face it awake. Let us hold our inner center as the world trembles, for it is from within the darkest depths of the unconscious that the brightest light is always born. The descent is complete. Now begins the return.